My greetings from Bujumbura in Burundi to all participants of Challenge Team number 8 named Digitalization of Indigenous Technology in African Agriculture for Fostering Food Security. Good morning or good evening to all, depending where you are following now the current webinar. It is shining and raining somewhere in Burundi country, and we all expect good agriculture season A starting now in Burundi. My name is Antoine Kantiza, legal representative of the not-for-profit organization Promotion of Learning in Distance, PREAD in short, and a responsible of Akantiza Consult, an executive agent of PREAD. I am expert in e-learning, expert in farmer data management, sharing and service for agricultural development, expert in national adaptation plan, building climate resilience in agriculture, and in many other fields like research policy methodology, intellectual proper marketing skill for Africa, adaptive leadership, or in trade for development in the age of global value chain, World Development Report 2020, to name a few. I have participated in many hackathons, including Hackathon Inspire Nairobi during 2019 or in Hackathon Inspire Kampala in 2020. I'm a future member of the agriculture community. My profile is available online, such as at www.linked.com/in/Antoine Kantiza Pool 44660-325/. Today, we will focus our webinar on the first topic of the challenge number 8, named Why the Traditional Technology of Agriculture is Disappearing. I invite you to follow the 12th slide of PowerPoint, beginning with the 4 points in the background before analyzing the 5 main points of the acting topic. Now, I just finished with the headline. We go on with the slide background number 1. Traditional technology as the basis of modern science and technology. Jess Popper of London University, in his publication How Indigenous Technology Advance Modern Science and Technology, states that the traditional technology, together with the indigenous perspective, are the outcome of indigenous science, meaning that the traditional technology is the first pillar of indigenous science, which evolved in modern science and a new adaptive technology. Background 2. Indigenous technology inside African traditional science, result of empirical experience in dealing with the whole human development embedded in a given cultural community, such as in African community, where a specific indigenous technology has emerged in over time. Subsequently, African traditional technology expressed the indigenous technology used by African community to afford its development before crossing over external culture like the Western value. Fernandez, quoted by Senanayak, wrote that indigenous technology is the unique technology confined to a particular culture or society. It is known as local technology, traditional wisdom, or traditional science. This technology is generated and transmitted by community in over time in order to survive and cope with their own agroecological and socio-economical environment. We go on with background 3. Traditional technology as footprint of technology. The African traditional technology has been used to cope with the daily challenge of African community, including the management of food security, in taking care of human and animal health, and in ensuring professional education at the youngest, according to the African environment, African environment evolution, like the extension of diesel, volcanic eruption, rain precipitation, followed by water devastation, or over effect of climate change during the decades, making a footprint of African ecosystem specifically dealing with agriculture and livestock production by traditional know-how added to the hard-working. Accordingly, the African traditional technology is mostly akin to the agro-environment technology and more specifically to the closer agroecological know-how. Background 4. Background 4 is focused on the sustainable subsistence crops driven from African technology. The agriculture of crops for subsistence, used mostly for feeding African community, follows the rules and know-how inspired by African knowledge for mastering the African ecosystem. I quote the example of sorghum, bananas, and Elzin colcana or finger millet crops, which remain the basic food products as well as for beverly adapted to the resilience of African ecosystem specificity. What are evidence for feeding pupils in Burundi country and in the neighbors country of East African, South, North, and Central Africa since many decades? Many other crops like cassava, maize, beans, and millets used currently in Africa are driven somewhat from African technology adapted to African-specific ecosystem community for reinforcing food security. Now, the main points related to the reason for the traditional technology is shrinking in Africa in its favor of food in Africa in its favor of food security. Deficit of formal education in African traditional technology. Indigenous language replaced by universal language for technology appropriation. The environment-based healthcare substituted by modern medicine. The traditional technology not capitalized by young generation of farmer. The environment galopant degradation dropped the basis of technology, traditional technology. Now, a point, the deficit of formal education in traditional technology. The education laments the traditional technology perspective. In the former times, traditional technology were transmitted to the youngest toward the learning by doing, good practice. Accordingly, the young farmers knew how to perform in agriculture and livestock by following their elders in their daily farming activity. In the current period, agricultural technology is driven from modern school. Nevertheless, even the best practices of traditional technology are not available in school books. Reason why traditional technology could not be taught in modern school. What is more, the traditional technology in agriculture is believed to be incompetitive and unproductive. Indigenous language replaced by universal language in knowledge appropriation. The indigenous language were primarily the support for the traditional technology transmission, when the modern technology is currently transmitted in the appropriate toward universal language. More traditional farmers control indigenous language, more they could share technology driven towards those indigenous language in mastering their close environment, for predicting climate change, for breeding livestock adapted to the soil, for conserving food in the long term, and looking for medicine in the environment and ecosystem nearby. The indigenous languages are shrinking in Africa, and at the same time, the traditional technology are disappearing as they are almost unspoken by the young generation, who is attentive to the universal language, which are the support of technology driven by modern school using written books, and not at all the oral tradition disappearing within its oral traditional technology. The environment-based health substituted by modern medicine. The ancestors used the environment technology for providing health care. What is repressed currently with environment technology has been used during centuries in searching for medicine for crops, roots, stems, or fruits of some specific trees in order to prevent against human and animal disease and healing the sick, such as the variant of aspirin, alistatic acid, discovered many years ago in juice or roots of fruit or roots or leaves of trees found in African natural forest or abroad. The modern medicine have repressed forever the environment-based African technology in providing natural health care because there are not evidence written in scientific books asserting the relevance of African technology in ensuring health care. The traditional technology is capitalized by new generation of farmer. The younger generation of farmer didn't capitalize the know-how in the farmer used by their elders farmer who are not referenced by modern school. The elder farmers, as soon as new plantation, new seed, and new agricultural practice were introduced in their environment. The traditional knowledge is not well appropriated by young generation attracted by the new agricultural practice driven by the updated agronomic science. For instance, the new generation of farmers didn't perform in building a safe storage system of foods production like Ikigega used for grain storage during many centuries, as it is reported in the history of the great region of Africa like Burundi and neighbor country, where the ancestral grain storage is still available. The environment galopant degradation dropped the basis of traditional technology. The environment degradation has forced people ever to move from their traditional space to the new rural area or to land in towns. The environment galopant degradation due of many hazards like climate change has forced people moving from their traditional space and the format the new ecosystem of rural area, or to cope with the hard reality of seeking job in town, the current conflict driven by speed, urbanization, as well as the scarcity of basic resources in town. In the same time, the former farmers dropped their traditional agricultural technology based on mastering their traditional environment. The environment galopant degradation induces also the reduction of biodiversity, such as forest, and shift the natural ecosystem, which were the basic traditional technology. Conclusion: the deficit of food security increased while African traditional technology is throwing. The deficit of food security is increasing in many areas if modern agriculture is focused on production is put before, of course. In some times, the African traditional technology is being forgotten as formal education is lacking for supporting best practice driven from indigenous technology. The challenge number 8 is targeting to safeguard the best practice of African traditional technology by the digitalization of indigenous technology for fostering food security. Now it is time to thank you for listening, and I welcome you in the discussion within your invaluable input for fostering food security in Africa by enhancing best practice of traditional technology toward digitalization and education. You are together with Antoine Kantiza, mentor of challenge number 8 in the framework of COVID-19 Hackathon 2020. My email is antoinecantiza@hotmail.com or antoinecantiza@yahoo.fr or antoinecantiza@gmail.com. You can reach me on my mobile phone 0025779994560. I live, of course, in Bujumbura. I wish you to have a good time and to share with us during those webinar that I wish good success for the challenge number 8. Nice for listening. Thank you for all. Thank you to Benti for hosting the current webinar. Have a good time.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Didier Muyiramye. I'm currently based in Kigali in Rwanda, and I'm a researcher in data-driven and digital agriculture field. So today I'm really happy to share with you this presentation on the documentation and dissemination of African agriculture indigenous knowledge, where I will be talking about more about the role of digital technologies in bridging the existing knowledge gaps. So before I continue with the presentation, I first wanted to share with you the outline of it. So I'll be talking about the key characteristics of indigenous knowledge. Second, the classification of indigenous knowledge in agriculture. And then thirdly, the knowledge gaps when it comes to the documentation and dissemination of indigenous knowledge. And fourth, I will be digging deep into how can we bridge the gaps and what is the role of digitalization as the topic of our conversation. And then lastly, the challenging implications or concerns that actually that are challenging us to do the documentation of the indigenous knowledge. So first of all, I thought it's good before we talk about the digitalization of African indigenous knowledge. I thought we could also somehow first look at the characteristics of this indigenous knowledge, because some of them can actually dictate us how to move forward with the documentation of or dissemination of the African agriculture indigenous knowledge. So the first one I wanted to highlight is that the indigenous knowledge is localized, uh, which means that it's actually rooted in a particular community, and most of the times that's why it's not applicable 100% to the other communities. So yes, we do have some type of the indigenous knowledge that can be applicable to other regions, but we also have to consider that for some part of it or some type of the indigenous knowledge, depending on different reasons, depending on the environmental conditions of a certain region, depending on the crops being grown in a particular place, then it sometimes not it shouldn't be applicable to the other regions because of those differences. So that's the first one. And we also know that this is mostly based on experiences and not theories. So we know that the indigenous knowledge is actually built over time, basing on the observations and also hands-on experience of certain generation of people within a certain community. The other characteristic I wanted to highlight is repetition. So as I was saying, when learning about the indigenous knowledge, or maybe when it comes to updating the indigenous knowledge, uh, the repetition factor is there, and it's a must to really confirm certain facts of the indigenous knowledge. And again, we should also be aware that the indigenous knowledge is constantly changing. If in the face of the current changes of nature that actually most of the times lead to what we call climate change and variability, this also have an effect on the indigenous knowledge, or it's actually even a threat. It's threatening the indigenous knowledge, um, uh, because traditional sources of knowledge, so they are also produced, reproduced, or even lost due to those changes that I'm mentioning. So it's threatening the indigenous knowledge, and we also have to consider that when we are studying, or when we are looking at ways of preserving our indigenous knowledge. Okay, secondly, this is probably this will be talked about, I mean, this will be told by many speakers. Um, uh, this indigenous knowledge in African agriculture can be categorized in many segments, or many sectors of agriculture, subsectors of agriculture. Firstly, we know that this indigenous knowledge has been used to study climate, or to confirm certain weather or climate events, or even to predict them. Another thing is that it's been also used in pest management, by, for example, the use of medicinal plants or animal waste that was used to treat animals, or actually that is still being used to treat animals in certain regions, or even to make pesticides, or even uh, the crop rotation or crop diversification. Another thing is that this type of knowledge has been used in post-harvest technology. So our ancestors had a way of storing food or preserving it using, let's say, granaries, and this had a positive effect on reducing post-harvest losses. And the other uses we can mention is irrigation and water management. Some other uses concern soil fertility maintenance, like the use of organic or compost manure. And lastly, soil conservation, but also there are many more uses of it in agriculture. And this one is talking about the knowledge gaps. So we know that that type of knowledge is there. However, there are still challenges in, or maybe gaps in how this type of knowledge is disseminated from generation to generation. So here I wanted to highlight what are maybe the causes of that poor dissemination or poor documentation of this indigenous knowledge. So firstly, there's a poor knowledge or poor technology transfer initiatives from elders to young farmers. Little is known by young people. If you go on the field, if you are doing research, if you ask young farmers, you will actually be surprised that it's not that maybe they don't want to use it, but most of them, they don't even actually know that this type of knowledge exists. Or even those who even know at least that this type of knowledge exists, they have a low trust towards it as compared to the modern science. So that's also another challenge. And there is also a communication barriers related to the languages. That most of the times prohibits the indigenous knowledge to move easily or to circulate easily from one country, region, tribe to another. Here we know that the indigenous knowledge is actually found in many dialects on the African continent. Unfortunately, as some of these indigenous knowledge, some of these indigenous languages or indigenous dialects are disappearing, this sometimes also translates into the loss of the indigenous knowledge. So another point is that there is a poor interest from farmer organizations in putting together or documenting their historical records on past produce, past harvest, or maybe on the weather events that they experienced in the past, or even, let's say, the invasion of pests. So these historical records should be actually also the base of updating or producing a new types of indigenous knowledge. Unfortunately, there's a poor interest from the farmer organization, mostly in recording those past events. Again, another important point to consider or to mention is that there's also a low level of interest from extension organizations or even research institutes in the promotion and documentation of the indigenous knowledge. And lastly, we know that the memory lapses or the deaths of elder people is also a barrier to the documentation and the dissemination of this indigenous knowledge. I'm quite sure you know the African proverb that says that whenever an elder person dies, and it's the whole library which is burnt. So, which also emphasizes the need to really talk to these elder people, these old people, to make sure that they share this knowledge with us. So this one concerns how do we bridge these gaps? How do we bridge these knowledge gaps, and what could be the role of digitalization? So firstly, I wanted to also to first uh, differentiate digitalization with digitization, which is most of the times uh, a mistake that most of people do. Digitization, which concerns most of the times, digitization is actually a way of shifting from analog to digital. However, digitalization is much more huge, much more broad, because it encompasses many other components. Here I'm sharing the framework of digitalization for agriculture, which highlights that this is comprised of four main components. Uh, the first one being the digital agricultural innovations. These includes the digital solutions or digital technologies. Uh, Digital technologies, we can maybe mention technologies like blockchain, technologies like robots, or even artificial intelligence. Those are technologies. But when we talk about solutions, we can mention, let's maybe solutions on the production level, on the market level, on the finance, supply chain, or other segments of the value chain. And this framework, as I was saying, we could also see how do we pick some of these and maybe apply them to what we are discussing about, to see how we can do the digitalization of indigenous knowledge. So some of these components, they can be also applied in what we are uh, aiming at. So the second point I was talking about is enabling big data and analytics. This is more focusing on creating quality data by consolidating the facts, as I was saying, and making sure that record we do record the past scenarios. For example, here they talk about digital identity, which also can concern profiling farmers and knowing, okay, these farmers, they're doing this and this, they're growing this type of crops, they're based in this region, they have a certain size of the farm. So these are all records that should be also um, um, kept somewhere, and then they could be the base of developing different technologies, different solutions, or even basing on the existing uh, digital agricultural innovations to really um, uh, make sure that we apply them to what we are discussing about digitalization of indigenous knowledge. And the third point concerns the facilitation of business development services. Uh, this concerns more about who is paying for these services. But it's also something we can also think about. Yes, we do provide solutions for farmers, we do develop technologies, but most of the time what people forget is how is this going to be sustainable? Is the farmer going to afford or to pay for these services, or is someone else paying for them? So this should also be taken into consideration. The fourth and last point here is to see how this how do we promote the enabling environment. Here we talk about the key institutions that develop policies or that put out the regulations that actually can drive this. So here, most of the what is mentioned here, I think I talked about them. Maybe the third point is that we see that digital tools and devices like drones, smartphones can facilitate services like surveying, measuring, mapping, monitoring changes on people's land. So here, the main idea is to see how some of the components of that framework of digitalization of agriculture, how can we apply it also to what we are talking about as digitalization of indigenous knowledge. So yeah, they also talked about digital technologies like blockchain that can be used also to preserve indigenous knowledge through the traceability of key natural resources. And the last point concerns what I was talking about, the promotion of enabling environment. So we need to invest efforts in policies, research, and to really build this knowledge. So the last point is what are the challenging implications? Some of them that I can mention, there's a lack of access to digital tools. So even if the ICT has the potential to effectively document the indigenous knowledge, unfortunately, the farmers' levels of adoption they are still low due to the low digital divide and digital illiteracy of farmers. The second point is that climate change and cultural changes are also threatening the indigenous people, but also, of course, the indigenous knowledge. Again, the translation, we need to pay attention to how to translate the indigenous knowledge from one language to another, because most of the times if we don't really pay attention, the content is lost, and then we will end up having two different versions of indigenous knowledge. And the last thing is data rights and ownership. We know that in this time of data, of promoting the use of data, this is also a crucial thing. So we have to consider that this knowledge belongs to exclusively to the indigenous communities, so they need to also be approached and if need be, we can also develop codes of conduct to make sure that this knowledge is not totally taken from a certain community without really highlighting the ownership of that knowledge.